My name is Daniel Callahan. I'm 52 years old. I was sitting in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon in October when a man I'd never met slid a manila folder across a mahogany desk and said, "Mr. Callahan, I think you need to look at this before we go any further." I'd driven to that office thinking we were there to talk about my father's estate. Dad had passed 6 weeks earlier, prostate cancer, 2 years of fighting, then a Tuesday morning where he simply didn't wake up. He was 79. He'd built a small manufacturing company in Akron, Ohio over 40 years, and when he died, he left behind a house, a retirement account, and a business worth somewhere between $2.10 and $2.4 million depending on who was doing the valuing. I was his only child. Or so I believed. The folder contained a single sheet of paper. A lab report. The kind with columns of numbers and percentages that most people can't read. But at the bottom, in plain language, there was a summary line. I've read it probably 1,000 times since then. It said, probability of paternity, 0%. My name is Daniel Callahan. I'm 52 years old. I was married for 24 years to a woman named Renee. We have 2 children, or I thought we had 2 children. My daughter Cassie is 21. My son Tyler is 19. The lab report was about Tyler. But let me start from the beginning. I grew up in Fairlawn, which is a suburb of Akron that's the kind of place where everyone knows your father's name because your father coached Little League or sat on the church council or sponsored the scoreboard at the high school baseball field. My dad, Robert Callahan, did all 3 at various points. He was a quiet man. Methodical. He started Callahan Precision Parts in 1981 with a $40,000 loan from his own father and a used CNC machine in a rented garage. By the time I was in high school, he had 34 employees and a 12,000 square foot facility off Route 18. He never talked about money. He talked about quality. He used to say, "Do the job right the first time and the money takes care of itself." I went to University of Akron, got a degree in mechanical engineering, worked for a larger manufacturing firm in Cleveland for 7 years, then came back to Akron in 1999 to help my dad run the business. That was the plan all along. He'd built it for me. He never said that directly, but we both knew it. I met Renee in 1998 at a work conference in Columbus. She was in marketing for a medical device company. She was sharp, funny, good-looking in a way that didn't require a second glance because the first one was enough. We dated long distance for 8 months, she moved to Akron, we got married in June of 2000. My dad liked her. My mom, who passed in 2009, liked her too. Renee had that quality where she made people feel seen when she talked to them. It was her professional skill and it was also just who she was. Cassie was born in 2003. Tyler in 2005. For most of our marriage, things were fine. Not exciting, fine. We had a 4-bedroom house in a good neighborhood, the kids went to good schools, we took vacations to Florida and once to Costa Rica. Renee had stopped working full-time when Cassie was born and picked up part-time consulting work when the kids were in middle school. I was at the plant a lot. Long days, some weekends. My dad's health started declining around 2018 and I was managing more and more of the operation while also trying to be present at home. That's where the cracks were. Not dramatic cracks. Just distance. Renee and I stopped talking about much beyond logistics. What's for dinner? Who's picking up Tyler? Did you call the plumber? I noticed it, but I told myself it was just a phase. Busy years. It would pass. There were signs I chose not to read. She started going to a gym I'd never been to, about 20 minutes from our house when there was a perfectly good one 8 minutes away. She was protective of her phone in a way she hadn't been before, not paranoid, just careful. She started having wine with a friend named Andrea most Thursday nights, which was fine, except I'd met Andrea twice in 10 years and Renee had never been particularly close to her before. I noticed these things the way you notice a small sound in a wall, you hear it. You file it somewhere in the back of your mind, and you go back to whatever you were doing. Then my dad died. And 6 weeks later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office looking at a DNA test I hadn't ordered. The lawyer's name was Gerald Pittman. He was the executor of my father's estate, had been my dad's attorney for almost 30 years. He was in his late 60s, white hair, the kind of careful quiet that reminded me of my father actually. When he slid that folder across the desk, he did it slowly. He gave me time to pick it up. He didn't say anything while I read it. When I looked up, he said, "Your father commissioned that test 14 months ago. He asked me to hold it until after his death and present it to you during the estate proceedings." I sat with that for a moment. He knew, I said. He suspected. Then he knew. He didn't tell you because he didn't want to cause pain while he was still alive and while the outcome was uncertain. He also wanted to make sure the estate was structured properly before this conversation happened. I asked what that meant. Gerald opened a second folder. My father had updated his will 11 months ago. The business, the property, the retirement accounts, all of it was still coming to me. But there was a clause. A specific, carefully worded clause that stipulated the inheritance could not be commingled with marital assets and was to be held in a separate trust structure in my name alone, with Renee explicitly excluded as a beneficiary under any circumstance. My father had also included a letter. 3 pages, handwritten. I won't read all of it here. But the last paragraph said, "Daniel, I don't know everything. But I know you. And I know you'll handle this the right way. Take your time. Be smart. Be calm. That's all I ask." I drove home that afternoon and I didn't say a word to Renee about any of it. I made dinner. I asked Tyler about his classes. He was a sophomore at Ohio State at that point, home for the week. I watched some television. I went to bed. Renee fell asleep next to me and I stared at the ceiling for 4 hours. My father had left me more than a business. He'd left me a roadmap. And 14 months of lead time he'd used to protect what he'd built. Now it was my turn. I want to be honest about what those first few weeks were like internally, because it matters for understanding what I did and how I did it. I wasn't enraged. I know that sounds strange. I think the rage was there somewhere beneath everything, but the dominant feeling was something more like grief layered on top of grief. I just buried my father. And now I was processing the possibility that my son, a kid I'd coached through Little League, driven to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning for 6 winters, helped move into his dorm room, might not be my biological son. I say possibility because I hadn't yet confirmed the test independently. I trusted Gerald. I trusted my father. But before I did anything, I needed my own confirmation. I also needed to understand what I was actually dealing with regarding Renee. So I did what my father had implicitly told me to do. I was calm. I was methodical. And I started making moves so quiet that she never heard a single one. The first call I made was to a family law attorney named Sandra Reeves. I found her through a referral from Gerald. He knew her professionally and said she was the best in Summit County for complex asset cases. I met with Sandra on a Thursday morning, told her I didn't want to share details until I'd confirmed the DNA situation independently, but that I needed to understand my options and my exposure. She walked me through everything. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are divided fairly but not necessarily equally. Inheritance, however, especially inheritance received and properly protected, is generally treated as separate property. My father's attorney had already done significant work to insulate the estate. Sandra confirmed that the trust structure Gerald had set up was solid. Then she asked me about our existing marital assets: the house, joint accounts, investments. We talked through all of it. She said, "If what you're describing is accurate, you're in a stronger position than most people who walk through my door. But we need to move carefully and we need documentation." I told her I understood documentation. She also said something I've thought about many times since. She said, "Mr. Callahan, whatever you're feeling right now, and I imagine it's a great deal, the most valuable thing you can do is feel it somewhere that isn't in front of your wife." I took that seriously. The second thing I did was order an independent DNA test. This required some planning. Tyler was home from college for a long weekend in early November. He'd left a coffee mug in his room, the heavy ceramic kind, half finished. I sealed it in a Ziploc bag, labeled it, and sent it along with a cheek swab of my own to a laboratory in Pennsylvania that processes private paternity tests with a 5 to 7 business day turnaround. I used my work address for delivery. I paid cash through a money order. I went to work every day. I came home every evening. I helped Renee plan Thanksgiving. I acted like a man whose father had recently died and who was dealing with estate paperwork, because that was also true. The results came back on a Wednesday. I opened the envelope in my office at the plant with the door closed. Probability of paternity, 0%. I sat there for a long time. I looked out the window at the parking lot. A guy named Pete who'd worked for my dad since 1994 was walking to his truck with a lunch bag. Normal Tuesday. Normal world. I folded the paper back into the envelope and locked it in my desk drawer next to my father's letter. Then I called Sandra Reeves. What followed was approximately 11 weeks of the most deliberate work I've ever done in my life, and I say that as someone who has run a manufacturing operation for over 20 years where precision is the entire point of existence. Sandra and I met every 2 weeks. Between meetings, I was gathering documentation. Every joint account statement going back 5 years. Tax returns. Property records. The titles on both cars. Investment account histories. I pulled all of it and organized it into binders with tabs, the way my father had taught me to organize project files at the plant. Sandra had a forensic accountant she worked with named Howard Birch. I hired Howard on her recommendation. He was a small, precise man who wore bow ties and spoke in complete sentences and had the demeanor of someone who had seen every financial deception imaginable and was no longer surprised by any of it. Howard went through our joint finances with the kind of attention I recognized from quality control audits. He found things. Not enormous things. Renee wasn't running some sophisticated financial scheme. But there were consistent cash withdrawals over a period of about 3 years, usually $200 to $400, once or twice a month, that didn't correspond to any household expense I could identify. There were charges at restaurants I'd never been to, on dates when Renee had told me she was with Andrea, or at a book club she'd joined. There were 2 charges at a hotel in Cleveland, both on weekends when I'd been traveling for work. Howard documented everything. Clean, organized, time-stamped. I still hadn't said a word to Renee. At Thanksgiving, I carved the turkey. I told her the stuffing was good, which it was. Her parents came and I shook her father's hand and talked to him about the Browns for 20 minutes. He's a decent man. He had no idea. Neither did she. But I noticed, during that holiday weekend, something I hadn't fully registered before. The way she looked at Tyler. There was something protective in it that went slightly beyond normal maternal affection. A watchfulness. Like she was waiting for something. I'd attributed it before to normal mom behavior. Now I read it differently. I also noticed that Tyler, who looks nothing like me, I'd always told myself he looked like Renee's side, also looks nothing like Renee. He's a big kid, 6 feet 2 inches, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw and a forehead that don't come from either of our families that I can identify. I looked at him across the Thanksgiving table and I felt something complicated that I'm not going to try to name here. He's still the kid I raised. That part doesn't change. But the reality of what I was looking at had shifted in ways I was still processing. After Thanksgiving, I made one more move before I was ready to proceed. I needed to know who Tyler's biological father was. Not for the divorce. Sandra told me I didn't need that information legally. But I needed it for myself. And I had a suspicion. Renee had worked, before she quit to raise Cassie, at a medical device company called Meridian Health Systems. Her boss there was a man named Gary Strickland. I'd met Gary 3 or 4 times over the years at company events. He was the kind of man who filled a room with a loud laugh, confident handshake, the type who called waiters by their first name 30 seconds after sitting down. Renee had always described him as a good mentor. A friend. She'd stayed loosely in touch with him, LinkedIn stuff, occasional mentions. Gary Strickland lived in Shaker Heights, which is where one of those hotel charges had been made. He was 54 years old. He had his own family, wife, 3 kids, the whole structure. He had no idea I existed as anything more than Renee's quiet husband in Akron. I hired a private investigator named Carl Dumont. Carl had been recommended by Sandra as someone who was thorough, discreet, and, in her words, doesn't do anything that creates problems later. I met Carl once, gave him the names and the hotel charges and the rough timeline, and told him I needed confirmation, not confrontation. He understood. Carl came back to me 3 weeks later with a file. He documented 4 meetings between Renee and Gary Strickland in the past 6 months alone, 2 lunches, 1 evening at a wine bar in Cleveland, 1 afternoon at a location I'll describe simply as not a restaurant. He had photographs taken from public spaces. Nothing invasive. Just documentation. He also, as part of his background work, had pulled some publicly available records on Gary Strickland that were interesting for a different reason. Gary had been in some financial difficulty over the past 2 years, a bad real estate investment, a lawsuit from a former business partner. His personal finances were considerably less impressive than his LinkedIn profile suggested. I thought about that. I filed it away. I now had everything Sandra needed. 2 independent DNA tests. Financial documentation from Howard. Carl's file. The inheritance trust documents from Gerald. Sandra said, "Daniel, I think we're ready." I said, "Give me 1 more week. I wanted to do one thing first." I drove to Columbus on a Saturday in late January. Tyler was between semesters, staying in his apartment near campus with a roommate. I told Renee I was going to visit him and take him to lunch, which was normal, I did it a few times a year. She had no reason to question it. Tyler and I went to a diner near his apartment. He ordered a burger. I had coffee and eggs. We talked about his engineering coursework, he's studying civil engineering, which I'd like to think I had some influence on, and about his girlfriend and about whether he wanted to come home for a long weekend in February. At some point there was a pause in the conversation and he looked at me across the table and said, "You doing okay, Dad? Since Grandpa?" I told him I was working through it. That I missed him every day. That his grandfather had been proud of him. Tyler nodded. He's not an emotional kid outwardly, takes after me in that way. He said, "I keep thinking about stuff," he said. Like the way he talked about the business. About doing things right. I said, he meant that about everything. Not just work. We finished lunch. I drove home. I didn't tell Tyler anything that day. I didn't know yet when or whether I would. That was a separate question with its own timeline. What I knew was that whatever happened next, Tyler was my son in every way that mattered for 19 years, and that was not something any DNA test was going to rearrange in my chest. The following Monday, Sandra filed. Renee received the divorce papers on a Wednesday morning. I was at the plant when it happened. Sandra had arranged for them to be served at the house at 10 a.m. when she knew I'd be out. Renee called me at 10:23. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 10:31. I let that go too. She texted, "Daniel, what is this? Call me right now." I finished a meeting with my operations manager about a supply chain issue we'd been dealing with for 3 weeks. I called her back at 11:45. She was crying, not the quiet kind, the loud kind, the kind that comes from genuine shock. She said she didn't understand. She said, where was this coming from? She said we could talk about whatever was wrong. She said she loved me. I said, "Renee, I need you to talk to an attorney. I'm not going to discuss this over the phone." She said, "Daniel, please. Tell me what's happening." I said, "Talk to an attorney." I hung up. That was the last real conversation we had outside of legal proceedings for 4 months. What happened in the days that followed was something I'd been warned about by Sandra but still had to witness in real time. Renee's first instinct was to go on offense. She hired an attorney named Marcus Webb, who Sandra knew by reputation as aggressive and expensive. Within the first 2 weeks, Marcus had sent 3 letters making various claims and demands. He was pushing for immediate temporary support, trying to establish Renee's lifestyle standard, arguing for occupancy of the marital home pending proceedings. Sandra handled it. That's what I was paying her for. What Marcus didn't know yet, what Renee didn't know yet, was the shape of what he was actually dealing with. He knew about the house and the joint accounts. He didn't know about the DNA test. He didn't know about Howard's financial documentation. He didn't know about Carl's file. And he didn't know about my father's estate, because the trust structure Gerald had put in place meant that inheritance wasn't part of what Marcus could reach for. Renee, meanwhile, was making calls. I heard about some of this through Cassie, who was living in Pittsburgh at the time and who called me the second week after the filing, upset and confused. Renee had called her and told her that I'd had a sudden emotional breakdown related to my father's death and that she was worried about me and didn't understand what was happening. Cassie is 21 and she is not her mother's daughter in terms of strategy. She is direct. She called me and said, "Dad, Mom is saying you're having some kind of breakdown. Are you okay?" I said, "Cassie, I'm not having a breakdown. I filed for divorce because I found out some things that made it the right decision. I can't tell you everything right now, but I will when I can. I need you to trust me." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Okay. I trust you." That was Cassie. Tyler called me 2 days later. His call was shorter. He said, "Dad, I'm not taking sides. But I'm not listening to what Mom's saying either. Whatever's going on, I know you're not crazy." I said, "Thank you, Tyler." He said, "You want me to come home?" I said, "Not yet. Finish your semester." The financial situation became clear to Renee and Marcus roughly 6 weeks into the proceedings, when Howard's documentation was formally introduced and the scope of the inheritance trust became apparent. There was a meeting, Sandra, Marcus, Renee, me, in a conference room in Sandra's office building where Marcus reviewed the trust documents for the first time. He was a tall man, Marcus, practiced at maintaining composure. But I watched his face when he got to the section outlining the trust's exclusionary terms. There was a flicker. Just a small one. The flicker of someone recalculating. Renee was sitting across the table from me. She looked different than I'd seen her in years, tired, unguarded. She was wearing less makeup than usual. Her hair wasn't done the way she normally did it. She looked like someone who hadn't been sleeping, which she probably hadn't. She looked at me once during that meeting. I looked back. I didn't look away and I didn't look angry. I just looked at her. She looked down at her hands. Marcus asked for a recess. Sandra agreed. In the hallway, I could hear Marcus and Renee talking in low voices. Not the words. Just the tone. The tone of someone explaining to their client that the situation is different than they thought. When we reconvened, Marcus had shifted from aggressive to methodical. He was now focused on the marital assets, the house, the joint investment accounts, the cars. In Ohio, those would be split equitably. He was building his case around Renee's years of not working full-time and her contribution to the household as the primary caregiver. It was a reasonable legal strategy. Sandra had anticipated it. What Marcus still didn't know was that the DNA test was coming. Sandra introduced the paternity documentation in the 6th week of formal discovery. She did it in writing first, a filing that went to Marcus and the court simultaneously. I wasn't present when Marcus received it. I imagine it was a significant moment in his office. The legal implications were specific and significant. In Ohio, a husband is presumed to be the legal father of children born during the marriage. That presumption can be challenged. Sandra had 2 independent DNA tests, both showing 0% probability of paternity, both from accredited laboratories, one of them commissioned by the deceased grandfather whose estate was at the center of the proceedings. My father, it turned out, had not just commissioned the test. He had done it through Gerald's office in a way that established a clear evidentiary chain. Gerald had insisted on it. My father had agreed. They had apparently talked about this at some length, these 2 old careful men, and they had been thorough. Marcus requested a delay. The judge, a woman named Patricia Holloway, granted 2 weeks. What happened in those 2 weeks, I learned later through secondary sources, was that Renee told Marcus the truth. Or most of it. She confirmed the paternity situation. She gave him Gary Strickland's name. Marcus, being a thorough attorney, looked into Gary Strickland's financial situation and determined that pursuing Gary for retroactive child support was both possible and, given Gary's financial difficulties, unlikely to yield significant results. More importantly, the paternity revelation changed the dynamic of the marital asset division. Sandra argued, and Judge Holloway ultimately agreed, that the long-term deception regarding Tyler's paternity was relevant to the equitable distribution analysis. It wasn't about punishment, Sandra was careful to frame it that way. It was about the economic reality that I had spent 19 years supporting a child who was not biologically mine under false pretenses, and that this had material economic implications. It also, significantly, affected how Renee's claim for long-term spousal support was evaluated. She had argued for 5 years of substantial support based on her lifestyle standard and her years out of the workforce. Judge Holloway awarded 18 months at a significantly reduced figure. The house was sold. We split the equity. The joint accounts were divided. The cars were sorted out. The investment accounts were split, accounting for her withdrawal history and Howard's documentation of the cash transactions, which the court treated as dissipation of marital assets. Renee's attorney had come in expecting to negotiate access to a $2.1 million estate. He left with an equitable share of a middle-class marital estate and 18 months of modest support. My father's business, his property, his life's work, all of it remained exactly where he'd put it. In a trust. In my name. Untouched. The final hearing was on a Thursday in April. It was not dramatic. Courtrooms are rarely dramatic in the way people expect. Judge Holloway read the terms of the decree. Both attorneys confirmed acceptance. Papers were signed. The judge said a few words about the process and wished both parties well in a tone that suggested she'd done this 1,000 times, which she had. I drove home after. I stopped at a diner on the way and ate a turkey sandwich and drank 2 cups of coffee. The waitress was a woman in her 50s with a name tag that said Donna, who refilled my cup without being asked and didn't try to make conversation. I sat there for about 40 minutes. Outside the window. It was a gray Ohio April, the kind where spring is technically happening but nobody believes it yet. I thought about my father. I thought about him sitting across a desk from Gerald Pittman, 14 months before his death, deciding to commission a DNA test and structure a trust and write a 3-page letter by hand. Thinking about me. Trying to protect me from something he'd discovered and couldn't undo and couldn't tell me because he didn't want his last years with me to be about that. Instead, he dealt with it the only way he knew how. Quietly. Methodically. The way he'd built his business and the way he'd raised me. I left Donna a $20 tip on a $14 check and drove home. There were things that happened after the decree that I'll mention briefly because they're part of the full picture. Gary Strickland, Renee contacted him when the paternity situation became legally known, presumably to tell him that his name was now in court documents. I don't know what that conversation was like. What I know is that Gary's wife filed for divorce from him approximately 6 weeks after our decree was final. I didn't engineer that. I didn't contact Gary's wife. Carl's file had been used only for my own legal proceedings. Sometimes consequences move on their own. Renee moved into an apartment in Akron. She went back to work, picked up a marketing consulting role with a small firm. I don't know the details of her financial situation now and I don't spend energy thinking about it. Cassie came home for a weekend in May, 2 weeks after the decree. We sat on the back porch of the house I'd rented, a smaller place, just right for me, and she asked me to tell her what had happened. Not everything. But enough. I told her about the DNA test and what it meant. I told her that I loved her brother regardless of any of it and that nothing about our family was going to change in the ways that mattered. Cassie cried a little. She said, "Did Mom know the whole time?" I said I believed so. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I told her she had nothing to be sorry about. Tyler called me in June. He was home for the summer, staying with a friend because the house was sold by then. He asked if he could come spend a few days with me. I said of course. He drove over on a Friday evening and we ordered pizza and watched a game and didn't talk about anything heavy that first night. The second day, he brought it up. He'd been told something by his mother, not everything, but enough. He asked me directly, "Is it true? About the DNA?" I said yes. He sat with that for a long time. We were on the back porch. It was a warm Saturday afternoon. He said, "You've known for a while." I said yes. He said, "You didn't treat me any differently." I said, "Tyler, you're my son. That doesn't change." He didn't say anything for probably 2 minutes. Then he said, "Okay. Just okay." Like that settled it. Like he decided something internally and filed it away and that was that. In that moment, I saw my father in him. Not in genetics, in temperament. In the way he handled the weight of a thing without letting it knock him over. I thought, my dad would have liked that about him. I'll tell you where things are now, about 8 months out from the decree. I run Callahan Precision Parts. We have 41 employees now. We picked up a new contract in the fall that's the largest in the company's history, a defense subcontracting deal that my dad had been pursuing for 3 years before he died and that his groundwork made possible. When we signed it, I stood in the middle of the plant floor and thought about him. About what he'd say. He'd probably say something like, "Good, now make sure the tolerances are right." I live in a rental house that's about half the size of the one I lived in for 20 years. It has a porch I like and a good kitchen and a garage where I've set up a small woodworking space. I go to sleep when I'm tired and I wake up when I wake up. There's nobody telling me I'm not listening or not present or not whatever the current complaint was. The absence of that low-level friction is something I'm still adjusting to, like someone who's worn a tight shoe for so long that going barefoot feels strange. Cassie visits once or twice a month. Tyler comes when his schedule allows. Last month we drove to Cleveland for a game, just the three of us, the way we used to when they were kids. Sat in the upper deck with bad hot dogs and watched the game. It was fine. More than fine. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. My father's letter is in my desk at the plant. The top drawer. I read it sometimes when things are difficult or when I need to remember what careful and patient look like in practice. The last paragraph. I keep coming back to it. Daniel, I don't know everything. But I know you. And I know you'll handle this the right way. Take your time. Be smart. Be calm. That's all I ask. I think I did, Dad. I think I did.